Good evening, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Talking Point. My name is Fahraaz Patel. We'd like to thank you, the few, for staying with us here on Hilaal TV, DSTV channel 347. When the Twin Towers went down and the United States of America, along with the United Kingdom and its allies, started detaining or created its war on terror, the so-called war on terror, when they reached out to places like Afghanistan and Iraq, the world's view saw prisons that were seemingly supposed to be, in the eyes of many, civilized. But many uncoveries, many investigations found that these prisons were not just torture prisons, but they were also considered death camps. This is how the world is seeing many of these prisons now being unfolded as the truth starts to come out with regards to that. One of my guests today, and a very important person in uncovering the truths about many of these prisons and was a detainee himself, is none other than Moazzam Begg. Moazzam Begg was detained and was imprisoned in the infamous Guantamo Bay and, of course, the Bargram prison, which everyone saw during the time of the US invasion of Afghanistan. I'd like to welcome him here to Talking Point. Moazzam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah so much for joining us.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's my pleasure to be here. I love being in South Africa. Alhamdulillah, I hope we'll have a wonderful discussion.
Alhamdulillah, no, without a doubt. Moazzam, your story has been told so many times. Your testimonies have been heard by millions across the world. It's quite ironic, isn't it, that when you have the West preaching democracy, civilization, or the peak of civilization, and then these are the camps that you and so many others were sent to. It kind of has this ironic tone to it, doesn't it?
I think it's more than irony. It's when the West talks about rights, as you said, human rights, and the rule of law, the fact that they create spaces where they can circumvent all of that and continue to do so, like Guantanamo, but other places, secret detention sites where I was held, and more importantly, many others were held. It tells you that when it comes down to the crunch, they don't care about those rights at all. They don't apply. And so they have outside Guantanamo, I still think they have these placards on the wall, which says, honor bound to defend freedom. Which is such an irony, because everybody behind these plaques is detained without charge or trial for the past 2+ decades.
Sure.
And that's your United States, which, of course, as we know, is the greatest supporter of Israel. And if they can do these kind of abuses, bearing in mind that one of the most, in fact, I'd say the most well-known prisoner right now in Guantanamo is a Palestinian from Gaza called Abu Zubaydah, who we can talk about afterwards.
Sure.
But just bear in mind that that's what the United States is doing, had done already to the Muslim populations of different parts of the world. So for it to support Israel in what it's doing, I think it's not far-fetched.
Yeah, we're going to touch so much to speak about, because you've just also returned from Syria, and I'm going to touch on that in the next segment. Moazzam, when you got caught, I actually do remember it because it was broadcast, and as a young child, I wasn't even in high school at the time. I watched it and I thought to myself, okay, what is going on here? Because the amount of spewage of propaganda that was coming from the United States government at that time was that every single person of brown skin color was the terrorist we were looking for, and they would lead us to Osama bin Laden at the time, was of course enemy number one across the world. When you were caught and you were then sent to Guantanamo Bay, when you saw the facilities in the prison, because you're also the director of Cage, which helps many prisoners who have been unlawfully arrested, what did you think at the time, given all that you are as a father and as a husband at the same time?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, but suffice to say that this isn't just about brown people, by the way. So Guantanamo, indeed, the targets of the United States of America haven't been only brown people. They've been black people. They've been white people. And indeed, Uyghurs from East Turkestan, Chinese people.
Sure.
But the common thread is that they're Muslims. The common thread is that they're seen to be an enemy because of the language that was created up to the war on terror and then afterwards. That these people are the worst of the worst, that they don't deserve human rights, they shouldn't be treated like humans. And therefore they did treat us in a subhuman way. And there's so much to be said about that, and it's been said many times. But for me as a father, for the other brothers as fathers, I always say I count myself extremely fortunate because I came home after 3 years.
Sure.
Some of my best friends and people I know and people who are still there after 20 years, 22 years, they come home to see children that are grown adults. They come home to see children that they've never seen before, they have no connection to. And the worst part of this is that they haven't been detained because they did something, they're detained because something was done to them. And I repeat again, some people remain in prison in Guantanamo, like Abu Zubaydah, not because of what he did, but because what they did to him. And that the torture was so horrific that now they don't want him to come out to talk about it.
There was something interesting I remember at the time when you were arrested, because obviously it happened in Islamabad, and it was under the leadership of Pervez Musharraf, was of course the Pakistani general running the country at the time. And I remember the CNN and NBC headlines, Al-Qaeda linked, Moazzam Begg has been caught, and then George W. Bush says, Tony Blair, I mean, I remember it was Tony Blair specifically because you are a British citizen, we have caught the link that will lead us to Osama bin Laden. When you arrived at the prison at the time, when you found so many Muslims, could you already uncover then that Islamophobia was their modus operandi in running these prisons?
Right from the beginning. So from the point that I'm taken from my house in front of my wife and my kids, hooded, shackled, hands and legs tied, carried off in the back of this vehicle, CIA agents dressed like Pakistanis asking me questions, threatening to send me to Guantanamo, the Pakistani intelligence acting like servants and slaves, and then eventually I'm taken by the Americans to the Kandahar facility and then Bargram. So I spent a while in these places.
Yes, I'm going to touch on that in a bit.
And so here, they ask me these ridiculous questions, and they ask it of everybody. This is just before they strip you naked, before they punch and kick you, before they shave your beard off and laugh that it is a funny thing to remove the beards of Muslims, to humiliate sexually, remove your clothes and so forth. You know that they're trying to break your spirit as a Muslim.
Sure.
We see them rip the Quran into pieces, we see them urinate upon it, we see them throw it up in the air and drop kick it. We see all of this happening. And it creates, they want to create that response because they're told that it's their religion. First of all, they're told that they did 9/11 and it's their religion that made it do it. So there's all of this that we have to try to deal with simultaneously while we've taken them from our homes and so forth. So we knew that we're in a place now that the hatred of Islam has gone beyond any description. And the only way to engage with this, either you resist and fight and you're going to get hurt, or you try to educate where you can. It's hard to educate someone when he's pointing a gun right at your head. It's really hard to do that. And you're stripped naked and you've got shackles behind your backs. But some of us try to do that regardless. And that was the test of us as Muslims, as human beings, as prisoners. And for the most part, I'd say either it makes you or it breaks you. And it made most of us.
I watched a documentary on yours on Al Jazeera. When you go back to Bargram prison, the emotions that poured out of you, some of the memories that you still could speak to, there were so many that which you went back to that were your friends at the time. Bargram prison, we saw it on TV when a lot of it was uncovered, what actually happened there. But the chaos that was there, the torture that was there, I don't think the viewers have maybe grasped an idea of just how bad that prison was, because it was launched at the time that the US invaded Afghanistan, and it was an executive order given by George W. Bush.
Bargram, I've always felt, people think of Guantanamo as the worst, but to me, Bargram was the worst. And if you ask anybody who's gone through that, they say it's the worst. It's because it was in the proximity of what they call a war, so the behavior of the soldiers was far worse than it was in Guantanamo. And I saw people murdered in that place. To me, it's a scene of a crime. It's still is American soldiers beat prisoners to death. I used to hear the sounds of a woman screaming in that place, as did the other prisoners. I didn't see natural light or day for an entire year. We didn't eat hot or cooked food for a year. And as a Muslim, I made dry ablution, which is tayammum. There was no water for wudu. We could just drink it and that's it. We couldn't pray in Jama'ah as Muslim prisoners. There was no Eid or there was no Jummah. There was, all the most basic things. You didn't even know the time for the prayers. You'd have to guess them because you've just got floodlights on 24 hours a day. So everything that you take for granted as a norm was turned on its head, and we had to improvise a lot.
After the break, I continue my conversation with Moazzam Begg. We're going to be talking about the Syrian prison camps under the regime of Bashar Al-Assad. Welcome back to Talking Point. I'm in conversation with Moazzam Begg. He is the director of a cage based in the United Kingdom. Again, Jazakallah so much for staying with us, Moazzam. Moazzam, you've just come recently from Syria. We've seen a revolution happen there just last year. Those prison camps, when I looked at it, it made the Soviet prison camps look like child's play. And the Soviet prison camps were horrendous under the time of Joseph Stalin and his successors. Talk to us about it, because those images it was difficult for the eye.
You've just mentioned before we spoke about going back to the Bargram prison and how it was there, and now returning there this time round, that I'm there with people who were in prison there now are running the prison. They're now in charge of that very prison where they were imprisoned.
Prisoner became the prison guard, yes.
Well, they became the owners. It's empty now. It's empty now.
Sure.
But it showed that there is a light at the end of the very, very dark tunnel. And I would never have expected it.
Sure.
And one of the things they used to tell me in Bargram, which was so frightening for me, is that if you don't cooperate, the CIA used to tell me this, we will send you to Syria. And they told me that they had sent people to Syria. So this is the CIA capturing people in Pakistan and Afghanistan and sending them to Syria.
So hold on, Moazzam, because there's two sides to the coin of this. Sorry, I'm interrupting you. The US had put sanctions on the Alawite government of Bashar al-Assad. But on the other hand, the CIA behind was sending prisoners to Syria. That's not ironic then. I don't know what it is.
So we can say there is dislike between the governments, but they dislike something even more. And that's Muslims with a political identity.
Sure.
And I had met people on my trip to Syria just now and before. I met one person and I was looking for or trying to locate others who have been tasked by their family to locate their relative, their father, who had been put on a CIA rendition flight from Pakistan, where they were detained, to Syria. And they had told me how they'd spent time in Sednaya, in Palestine branch, in 215 military Air Force branch. And these are a series of secret prisons. And I went into some of those secret prisons and looked at the cells. And honestly, I've seen cells, not just in Bargram and Guantanamo. I've been to Libya, I've been to other countries and seen cells of prisoners. These were horrific. They made Guantanamo look like a 5-star holiday camp. They made my experience seem like I know nothing about prisons. And looking at those cells and speaking to prisoners, men and women who'd gone through there, is one of the most horrific experiences that I've ever come across. Women who were raped in the prison and gave birth in prison. We saw their clothes, the children's clothes, the bottles and so forth. Prison cells where they've got about 200 prisoners in a relatively small cell with one toilet between them, spending years in prison.
How many prisoners?
Hundreds.
For one toilet?
So you could say 250 in one.
That's how apartheid operated in this country.
Yeah, it's to that level.
In the ghettos and in the rural areas or the townships.
I've heard some of those stories, and they also told me, and again I know this from the apartheid, people saying, being told that yes, somebody slipped and they just died. They committed suicide.
Yes.
These are officially kind of notes.
Yes.
People dying. They were carrying out bodies. The brothers there told me they were carrying out bodies every single day, and they couldn't keep count of the numbers of people dead. I'm trying to locate one individual whose family has tasked me, please can you find my father? I haven't seen him for 20 years. We don't know whether he's in a mass grave. We heard that there's still some prisoners alive somewhere else that have been sent elsewhere. Please could you help find him? So that was one of my tasks to trying to do when I went there last, and it's an impossible task amongst hundreds of thousands of prisoners.
You look at those prison cells in Syria. How evil was the Bashar Al-Assad regime?
You know, let me tell you something. There was a prison called Tadmor prison, which now was actually destroyed by ISIS back in 2016. The prison cells in Tadmor prison, if you look at them, they are the size of coffins, literally the size of coffins that are vertical. And they would put people in there so that you can't move.
How many people?
There's one person to each cell. There's only one person can fit in each cell. That was eventually destroyed, but having seen the other prison cells now, 1.5 meters by 1.5 meters, 2 meters by 2 meters, maybe the largest cells. I spoke to people who spent years in these cells. And you know, the really crazy thing, we found a register. And this register had names of people from all over the world, including Pakistanis, Indians, not South Africans, but Jordanians, Iraqis, Sudanese, Somalis. And it said the reason for their imprisonment was that they're a member of an extremist group called Tablighi Jamaat. I kid you not.
So if you were in Jamaat, they would...
If you were part of Tablighi Jamaat, you would be seen as an extremist who is worthy of being detained.
In Syria?
In Syria, especially as a foreigner. And this was back in 2005, long before the revolution. We've actually got the documents where that's detailed.
Listening to that, and when you see the jubilation in the crowd when that revolution happened on December the 8th, you can't help but wonder that this was necessary, because the regime of Bashar al-Assad and the Alawite and the Ba'ath Party regime, which lasted for 30 to 40 years, it was supposedly sort of like a culture to just torture prisoners, wasn't it? When you look at the history of how this government and this family of al-Assad had actually operated.
Well, you know, the family had been in power for 54 years. So
54
years, a yoke around the neck of the people. They'd massacred people during an uprising in the city of Hama in 1982. 40,000 people killed. And they were, again, imprisoning people and executing people at the rate of 30 to 40 per day. It's also, we have to stress this point, that people have believed that Bashar al-Assad was this kind of great supporter of the Palestinians. Now, I want to explain
Yes, I want to touch on that, because how many Palestinian prisoners? I saw a report uncovering that there were so many Palestinian prisoners that were sent there. And you think to yourself, oh, come on, surely he's not a supporter of not even just the liberation of Palestine, but the human rights of the Palestinian people.
So understand this. There's one prison, and that's I spoke of it earlier. It's called Fahraaz Palestine, which in Arabic means Palestine branch. The reason why it's called Fahraaz Palestine is because initially the prisoners brought in this place were Palestinians. Which type of Palestinians? Not the ones from the kind of leftist background, but the ones who were practicing, meaning the Islamic Palestinians as part of the Islamic vision and so forth for the future. But far worse than this, there's a region called Yarmouk refugee camp, Mukhayyamat Yarmouk, which I went to, where everywhere you will see Palestinian flags, because these people are Palestinians, and there's tens of thousands of them
coming from the Nakba time.
From the Nakba period,
yes,
right? If you go in there, I was going to take pictures and post them and say, brothers, I'm in Gaza, because it looked exactly the same. It has been decimated, destroyed, bullet holes in every wall, bomb holes, flattened roofs, people living in between that, little kids running around barefoot in the mud, women living in places where there's no water, no electricity, no access to any services, no sanitation, rubbish everywhere. And that's in Syria. That's what was happening and continues as a result. The Palestinians are still living in that situation, not in Gaza. Of course, it's in Gaza even worse, but this is just outside Damascus.
And one would think that, obviously, being the Ba'ath Party or the Alawites being Arabs, you would think that the supposed support for them would have been stronger, or the supposed understanding of what they're going through. But this sounds worse than what the Zionist government is doing. In
many ways, there are things that are, as I said, the horrific prisons. I still can't get over that. Those prisons are just horrific. but the treatment of Palestinians, or a particular type of Palestinian, it's important to say that, because there'll be some Palestinians that they supported.
Yeah.
But the particular type of Palestinian, the fight that ones that's resisting right now in Gaza, are the type that were being tortured and imprisoned and thrown out of their homes, and their homes being destroyed.
Moazzam, right now in Guantanamo, and you've mentioned it, that it's many other ethnicities that are there. When you see what Donald Trump is doing now, there are many Latino Americans that are going there. So much to a point where his executive orders are allowing Guantanamo Bay to still have this notorious feel to it. Yeah. You being there, I mean, talk to us about how horrible Guantanamo Bay is. And in the next segment, I want to touch on what we saw in Iraq also during their invasion there.
Just to make a difference between those kind of migrants who are being sent there, the Latinos, they're not being sent to the prison camp of Guantanamo where the prisoners are.
Okay,
but nonetheless, prior to Guantanamo opening as a U.S. prison for after the War on Terror, in the 1990s, early 90s, it was called Camp X-Ray, and it was used to house Haitians who were fleeing disasters, and so it had already been a place to hold people en masse, essentially because they're the other, they're dark-skinned, African-looking, so forth. Yeah. So the dehumanization process continued, but it continued with us. And you look, almost everybody in Guantanamo has been brought over either from Asia or Africa in chains to the Americas. And I think if you look at that as a visual,
yeah, well, I'm thinking 1800s transatlantic slavery. Yeah.
And that's exactly what the imagery tells you.
Yeah. And we all thought slavery was dead. Well, that's not the case. After the break, I continue my conversation with Moazzam Begg. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to Talking Point. I'm in discussion with the director of KH, Moazzam Begg. Moazzam, Shazakla again for staying with us. Moazzam, it's 2005. You get released from Guantanamo Bay by George W. Bush, who was the then President of the United States. Your role now with KH, talk to us about it, given that even now, more so in the Israeli prisons where children, and I must stress it's children, as young as 10, are being detained by the Zionist Israeli regime. I'm going to touch on Palestine in a bit, but for other prisoners that are being held unlawfully by governments on suspicion of quote-unquote terror or threats to the nation, what is your role to try and make sure that justice is given to them?
You know, a few years ago, I was asked by the International Criminal Court to give evidence about my experience and to seek evidence from others who'd also had that experience of imprisonment and abuse by the Americans in Bargram, particularly. We submitted that evidence in detail because the ICC said they were investigating 3 entities: the United States of America, the Taliban, and the Afghan National Army. Right. The United States responded by threatening Fatou Bensouda, who at the time was the chief prosecutor of the ICC, and said that if she attempts to investigate any of us, we will freeze her assets, we will arrest her and detain her and so forth. And so that threat became real because they really did put her on asset freezes and banned her from entering the USA. The next incoming prosecutor, Karim Khan, said, we have decided that we will no longer be investigating the United States of America and we're only investigating the Taliban. So that tells you to what extent how they care about these institutions of international law and so forth. But we constantly engage with that system, knowing that the system, I have not seen anyone prosecuted for their role in the war crimes that took place in Guantanamo and Bargram and beyond. Not a single person who mattered, not Dick Cheney, not Donald Rumsfeld, of course he's died, but he's the lawyers who were saying that it's not torture unless it's organ failure or death. And that's why they could use a medieval torture technique against Abu Zubaydah called tortura del agua, or torture of the water, where they tie your hands, tie your legs, tie your head, and they stuff a cloth in your mouth and pour water into your mouth. They did that to Abu Zubaydah 83 times, and they say that's not torture, that's just enhanced interrogation. So you can see they used every technique and beyond, and they're above the law. So what we're trying to do, from children to complete adults, is get involved in some way or the other, whether it's in the court of public opinion or in the courts of law. But what we find is that these entities are above the law.
I want to touch on what's happening in these Israeli prisoners where Palestinians are being held. What work are you doing there? Because it's quite difficult, isn't it, when a Palestinian child who's just defending his homeland throws a stone and is considered what the government in Tel Aviv would say a terrorist. And it's there. What is the work being done there, not just by yourself, but many other attorneys and lawyers that are associated with Cage?
So we have recently connected to lawyers who have been instructed by the Haraka al-Muqawama al-Islami, which is Hamas, to seek the deprescription of their organization in the United Kingdom, where they have been proscribed as a terrorist organization. Now, it is important we understand this. This isn't about Hamas. It's not about any... If you look at the history from the outset, from the birth of the State of Israel till now, every single Palestinian resistance organization has been banned as a terrorist organization. Whether they're Christians, whether they're Muslims, whether they're left-wing, whether they're Islamic, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, you name the organization, the PLO, Yasser Arafat, every one of them was labeled a terrorist. And that means that, ironically, in a world where we exist, where Israel constantly talks about its right to self-defense, even though it is on occupied land, even though it has been declared as a nation that operates apartheid laws and carries out ethnic cleansing.
From the ICJ.
From even before that, from even their own human rights organization like Beit Salam, like Amnesty International, Liberty and beyond. Despite all of that, the Palestinian child who picks up a stone is a terrorist. But the Israeli war machine that carries out mass killing, let's say you don't want to accept the word genocide, but you target children, where the reports show that the sniper bullet is hitting in the head of the child or the heart of the child long before October the 7th. They have no right to resist. That tells you that even according to international law, you have the right to self-defense, unless you're a Palestinian. Then you don't.
The Bashar Al-Assad prisoners, those who, and we watch it on TV, those who were liberated, and I must use the word liberated because that's what they are. Anyone that's been held a prisoner
Indeed
has that sense of liberation. What is being done there? He's currently now, if I stand to be corrected, the last that we were told, in Moscow.
Indeed.
What is being done there to try and hold him accountable? Because these are war crimes. When you listen to what is happening, human rights groups have now gone to Syria and have said that what Bashar al-Assad did in these prisons is considered a war crime.
Well, unfortunately, there are some people who are in this camp where that if you oppose Bashar al-Assad, you must be pro-Zionist, which is totally ridiculous.
Yeah, of course,
But there is that kind of narrative that's being pushed by a lot of people, but they can't answer the fact that the United States was sending people to Bashar al-Assad as part of their rendition program. They can't answer the fact that the Palestinians were being murdered and tortured by Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad is a war criminal, and indeed he should be sent, and the Syrian government has asked for him to be sent to face war crimes. The wonderful thing, I think, in a sense, the Afghanistan, they did this, and Syria, they've done this to some degree, is offer a general amnesty, including all those soldiers who took up arms, as long as they're not involved in serious war crimes, that there's no vengeance. There's amnesty. As the Prophet ﷺ said, La tathriba alaykum al-yawm. There's no vengeance on you this day. We need to go forward, build a nation, build ourselves together. We don't want vengeance. But like with anything else, I think South Africa knows this better. You can't go forward without truth, then reconciliation.
Well, I mean, we had the TRC, and a couple of weeks ago, I had 2 members who were prisoners by the apartheid government. And look, they're willing to move forward, but they want to hold them responsible. I mean, it's the same with the Jews that were, of course, prisoners under the Nazis during the Holocaust. I mean, you need to have that sense of accountability. Hence, we had Nuremberg. And this is, I'm assuming this is the work that Cage is trying to do. Accountability and then reconciliation, because only then can those steps be actually achieved.
Across the board, to be honest with you, I mean, if we can talk about that, we want to sound sort of nice and liberal and we want to go forward, but really, that's the people. That's the people who've gone through all of those abuses. And they want to see the country go forward, they can't forgive so easily. They can't forgive.
Yeah.
There must be a a cause for justice. And that's where the difficulty lies, because sometimes people take that law into their own hands, and it has happened in past weeks.
Sure.
But ultimately, if there isn't a process of justice, ultimately if war criminals are not held to account, then it's going to be hard to go forward. But unfortunately, the West has shown us this, that when it comes to their views, the West will never be held to account for their role in war crimes. In the war on terror, in Guantamo, in Bargram and beyond, there's Abu Ghraib, not a single leader who ordered what took place has been held to account.
In the next segment, I want to touch on that, especially when it was the invasion of Iraq, and we're going to touch on that in the next one. Moazzam, there's something interesting when you look at the Western view of everything, and of course, its so-called liberal ideas, and then you juxtapose it to international law, because for the last 1.5 years, since October the 7th, since the genocide started in Gaza, everyone's asking the question, can we as the citizens of the world trust international law? Moazzam Begg, do you trust international law, not just for the prisoners that have been held without trial, not for the prisoners that have been tortured in Guantamo, Bargram, the prisons of Bashar Al-Assad, but also for the people of Gaza who are being plundered even while we are speaking now by war machines like Israel?
In a simple word, no, not at all. I wish I could. I really wish I could. But the evidence is too overwhelming to show that the only people that will be held to any form of accountability are going to be African leaders of small states that have little significance in the world. There's nobody else that is going to, or even wants to be held accountable. Israel, the United States, I think China, even Russia, are not signatories to the Rome Statute to be subjected to the ICC. So essentially, they're above. We can say international law, but we could say their own laws. We could say the laws of the United States. According to the laws of the United States, you've committed war crimes. They won't hold themselves accountable to that either. So, as I said to you before, they're above the law. They're above their own laws. And so, what that means is that there is no justice in this world.
Before we go to the break, Moazzam, you were speaking about that Palestinian prisoner. He's been held in Guantanamo, to be corrected.
Yes.
What is the process now to try and, you're telling me of it, to try and at least, have the South African government get involved to try and have him come here as a refugee or asylum? Talk to us about it. Yeah.
So let's explain. Zain al-Abidin Mohammed Hussein is Abu Zubaydah. He, in fact, as a Palestinian from Gaza, when he was a young man, he wanted to be part of an army of liberation for his own homeland.
Right.
And that's eventually what led him to Afghanistan, etc. He was never a threat to the United States of America. The United States have recognized that he was never a threat to the United States of America, but they tortured him too much. And part of the torture program, as I said, they used that waterboarding against him. They sent him to a series of European nations where he was tortured by the CIA. Now listen to this. He has been compensated by each of those nations, Lithuania, Poland and Romania, at the European Court of Human Rights for allowing the CIA to torture him on their soil. So he's been compensated to the tune of something like $600,000.
So he was tortured on their soil by the CIA?
Before he was sent to Guantanamo.
Right.
Now that money is of no consequence to him because he's in Guantanamo in a cell where he's been there for around 20 odd years. He's never been charged with a crime. They don't intend to charge him with a crime. He's published these self-portraits, horrific, which your viewers can watch on the New York Times that were published through his lawyers, about him drawing how he's in a box, in a coffin, and they're waterboarding him in the coffin, how they've tied him down with his hands and his legs tied to the floor in stress position. He's described how they threw insects, dangerous insects on him while he's in this coffin. There's so many torture techniques that they've done upon him, tied his hands above his head to the top of a cage and left him suspended naked. He's drawn all of that, and they recognized in the CIA, the US Senate in 2014 did a report on CIA torture, and they identified at least 114 cases of torture. We believe there's tens of thousands, but this is 114 they accepted. Abu Zubaydah was one amongst them. So as I said, he's a stateless Palestinian for whom the United States created its torture program and he's innocent according to the letter of the law. Yet we can't find a place to take him because he has no state. And we're hoping that we can find nations that will have mercy on him as an innocent man and can rebuild the rest of his broken life as long as the United States are prepared to let him go. And we think the fear is that they're worried about, you see, his story has been made into a Hollywood film. It's been made into books. He's been given the sort of moniker, the forever prisoner, meaning too innocent to release, and they don't know what to do to charge him.
So he's got hero status already, yeah?
He has, indeed.
Yeah. Well, after the break, I'll wrap up my conversation with Moazzam Begg. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to Talking Point. Moazzam, I want to go to the US invasion of Iraq at that time, and we started seeing images of torture that were happening to Iraqi prisoners of war. When you see Tony Blair and George W. Bush being paraded, whether it's through the media, especially Tony Blair, who was, both him and Bush made these claims of weapons of mass destruction. The invasion happened. Till today, no evidence has been presented to it. And you see what's happening, well, you saw what happened in those prison camps in Iraq. You have to ask yourself, injustice there and there was done at the highest score, wasn't it?
It was unbelievable, and it's important we understand the connection between Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, one thing is that they were convinced that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, and it's true, he did at some point, because they gave them to him. They gave these weapons to him when Iraq was fighting Iran, and they feared the spread of Iranian-style revolution. But by that time that they had come to Iraq, he'd got rid of and destroyed, and that UN inspectors had come along and said, there are no weapons. But the real crucial thing, my friend, is this, is that there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq before the invasion.
Which George W. Bush had proudly claimed.
Right. And Al-Qaeda only came as a result of the invasion and because of it. And Al-Qaeda then eventually morphed into Islamic State in Iraq, which eventually morphed in itself to ISIS. So if you look at the chain of causation, it all happens in Iraq. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is one of the prisoners in Camp Bukha in Iraq. So part of this process happens. In fact, you see Obama, he says ISIS was an unintended consequence of our invasion. I'd say, well, how was it unintended? Your prisons were not unintended. Your bombs were not unintended. The rapes of prisoners, female and male, in Iraqi prisons by American soldiers were not unintended. They were very intended. So it's important that we recognize that this process happened. But there's something else. There's a case that's extremely important. I've spoken of it before. Ibn Sheikh al-Libi is a Libyan dissident who's imprisoned by the Americans. They believe he's an Al-Qaeda member, but he's not. They take him and torture him in Syria. They torture him in Egypt, and they take information. Then he gives under duress that Al-Qaeda is working with Saddam Hussein to obtain weapons of mass destruction. They pass this information to Colin Powell, who's the Secretary of State of the United States of America. He goes to the UN Security Council. He said, we have credible evidence that Al-Qaeda is working with Saddam. Let's invade. That becomes the key justification for the invasion of Iraq. Ibn Sheikh al-Libi then is sent back to Libya, where he turns up dead in his cell in 2009. And shortly after Libya sort of disintegrated, I went there and I walked into that cell and looked and asked prisoners, did he hang himself? And they said, no, he wasn't hanged. He was killed. So the circle closed. They didn't want the reason for the invasion of Iraq, which was the torture of a man, to come out in public. And this, in my view, and Colin Powell speaks about this, he said it was the most embarrassing point of my life, that I used evidence extracted by torture, which caused the justification to invade Iraq.
That said, it's a question I mentioned earlier on. Blair and Bush are being paraded. Blair appears on practically every British television show.
Unashamed.
Unashamed. And I look at that and I ask myself, you guys still haven't accounted for what happened at Iraq. There are US soldiers that took pictures of prisoners in Iraq like it's a circus.
Indeed.
They're laughing.
Indeed.
And I think to myself, no accountability for you. Why? Because you're not signatories to the Rome Statute.
Indeed.
if that's not unfair, if that's not unjust, then I honestly don't know what is. And the morality of the West, when you look at it now, has shrunk than it ever has been before.
I was once in my cell in Camp Echo, maximum security solitary confinement. I'd been there for 2 years. A man walks into the cell area outside. His name is General Jeffrey Miller. Jeffrey Miller was in charge of detainee operations in Guantanamo, and and the torture program happened there under him. He was sent to Abu Ghraib, where he was in charge of detainee operations, and he said, and I quote, "I'm going to Gitmoize the process here." And Gitmoizing means that I'm going to sexually humiliate and torture the prisoners. And it all happened under him. There was never a sense, no accountability for him at all. In fact, I think he got some accolades and some medals for his wartime experiences. So you can see, look, we've talked about accountability many times. These guys, and I said this is probably the third time I'm going to say it, they're above the law. The law does not apply to them.
So they act as rogues.
But they would be.
Rogues, yeah.
The rest of the world sees them as rogues. Locally or internally, they see them as heroes. That's the part. That's the part that can't sit with anybody well who believes in the systems that they've spoken of, human rights, freedom, the rule of law, democracy, and what have you. It's all nonsense. Complete nonsense.
Your letter to former US President Joe Biden, that's not going to see the light of the end of the day. Well, he's got his own issues right now.
Well, we sent it to him in the beginning of his...
Yes. I mean, was there ever some sort of a road to a response?
We'd hoped. You know, you always hope above hope. It was myself and 6 other former prisoners, all of us who are published authors, and we used that opportunity to say, look, we're drawing for you an 8-point plan, a roadmap of how you can practically close Guantanamo without damaging United States of America. And so we did that. We drew it up. We took advice from lawyers, from prisoners, from activists, from family members, but to no avail. And although some prisoners were released, it is, I can't say it enough, some prisoners have been released to places that are even worse than Guantanamo. And I give you the cases of 23 individuals who were sent from Guantanamo to the UAE, where they were promised they were going to start a new life, but they went straight from the plane into a prison where they remained. Some of them remained for 7 years, 8 years. And one prisoner I spoke with, he said that I've been imprisoned by the Soviet Union, I've been imprisoned by the United States of America, he's an Afghan, and I've been imprisoned in the UAE. The UAE was the worst because I'd expected a lot better from them.
Well, if you look at the Emiratis, the Sudanese are claiming the Emiratis are supplying RSF with weapons.
Yeah, indeed, there's that conversation.
I mean, there's counterclaims of chemical weapons. It's
indeed,
quite horrific when you listen. I mean, that's the reason why the Sudanese government took the Emirati government to the International Court of Justice. Of course, that case has been struck off the roll.
Yes.
Donald J. Trump, you're not going to win there, are you? I mean, I just watched, I'm sure you watched our president, Cyril Ramaphosa, last week when he was trying to reason him about the so-called white genocide, which was completely false. The pictures proved to be false. There's no way you're getting through to him with regards to Guantanamo Bay. It's very difficult, especially his vice, J.D. Vance, who's even more stubborn.
I have seen all of that. I've seen the kind of the shows. But I say never. You never know. And in some ways, it may be possible Donald Trump will play ball because he's a businessman, primarily. He's going to look to see where are the interests financially and beyond for America. So there are conversations. There are still Afghan prisoners in Guantanamo that we want released. There are the Taliban have Americans in custody. So there's scope for prisoner exchange. There's other prisoners that we're hoping we could find a home for through deals and so forth. So I say never. You never know.
To wrap up this conversation, Moazzam, your organization continuously works various prisons to be liberated, but from an Islamic point of view, the importance of taqwa, the importance of making sure iman is still within the prisoners themselves, especially Muslim prisoners. How important is that? Because at the end of the day, our faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our taqwa, our sabr is going to win the day.
Indeed, and we are an organization that operates on an Islamic ethos, and that ethos in relation to the prisoners is Prophet ﷺ said, "Udul marda," that visit the sick, wa atimul ja'i, that feed the hungry, wa fukkul aani, free the prisoner. And this is part of our belief system. The Prophet ﷺ also said, "Ad-dunya sajnul mu'min wa jannatul kafir," that this life, this temporal life, is the prison of the believer and the paradise of the disbeliever. So we want to focus on, in the end, despite all of the prison experiences we've had, it helps to build our faith. Every prisoner I've come across, whether they've been held for 20 years or 20 months or 20 days, have said that their connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increases in that period of solitude that they will have nowhere else and they've got no one else to turn to. It's a direct link between them and Allah. That's my experience and the experience of the other prisoners. Had it not been for prison, I would say I wouldn't be the person I was in connection and my strength of my connection to my deen. And I thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for it.
Unfortunately, we have to end the conversation. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. Jazakallah so much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My pleasure.
That's Moazzam Begg, director of Cage. And to end the show, there's a short excerpt of him visiting the Syrian prisons. From myself, Fahraaz Patel, the rest of the team in Johannesburg. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
This is collective, it's a prison cell where they have up to 200 to 200 people here, all packed together, and one bathroom, one toilet between them all. His brother was in this prison for a year and a half in this cell.
Look how small it is.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week imprisoned in this. This is the prison for women. We had cases of sisters that we were dealing with who've been in prison, including a British sister, which I believe her name was Fatima. She was in prison, I believe, here in 2009. Every single day they were carrying bodies out. Every single day. That means people who are tortured to death. And we're finding that there's a whole bunch of different people, including people from Jamaat al-Tabligh, who are Syrians. We found mentions of people who are from India, people from Pakistan, people from Iraq, people from Jordan, people from Sudan. So you can see, and
Somali.
What's happening here, and the dates on here are things like 2005 and beyond, which means it got nothing to do at all with the connection to the revolution. It's way before that.